The girl rushed into the Italian restaurant at 9:20 p.m. on a rainy Tuesday night. She didn't enter like a normal customer, expecting to be seated by the hostess, nor with politeness or consideration for the people dining peacefully at tables with white tablecloths and flickering candles. She entered like a hunted animal that had found the first possible hole to hide in, soaked to the bone because the rain outside was torrential, her brown hair plastered to her pale face, her eyes wide with terror that wasn't theatrical, but visceral and urgent. She was perhaps 12, perhaps 13. It's difficult to say exactly because her overly thin body suggested malnutrition that delayed her development, and her oversized clothes hid her frame. But she was definitely a child, definitely terrified, and definitely fleeing from something or someone that terrified her more than the concept of entering an expensive restaurant full of strangers without an invitation. She stopped just past the door, her breath ragged, rainwater dripping and forming puddles on the imported Italian marble floor. And her eyes quickly scanned the room, searching for something, someone, some form of salvation, or at least temporary refuge. Most of the customers just glanced with irritation or mild curiosity before returning to their conversations and meals because it wasn't their problem. A minor inconvenience that the manager would quickly resolve by removing the unruly child from the five-star establishment. But there was a man sitting alone at a table in the farthest corner. A table that was always reserved even when the restaurant was full. A table where no one sat without explicit permission because it belonged to him, to Marco Vitali, and he wasn't ignoring the girl. He was studying her with the intensity he used when assessing threats or opportunities, when deciding if something deserved attention or elimination. The girl saw him looking, and something in his face, something in the way he didn't look away when she desperately met his eyes, made her decide, made her take a calculated risk that a terrified child wouldn't normally take, except when all other options were worse than risking it with a powerful stranger in a public restaurant. She ran to his table, didn't walk politely, but ran, and waiters tried to intercept, tried to gently but firmly grab her to remove her before she bothered a more important customer in the restaurant. But Marco raised his hand, a small, but absolutely authoritative gesture that froze all the employees in place, that silenced protests before they began, that declared without words that the girl was allowed to approach, that any interference would be met with unpleasant consequences. She reached his desk and immediately fell to her knees beside his chair, not in dramatic pleading, but in physical collapse because her legs finally gave way under the weight of adrenaline and fear and exhaustion, and she looked up at Marco with eyes that were gray-green and contained the premature intelligence of a child forced to grow up too fast, who had seen things children shouldn't see, who begged for help even before her mouth opened to form words. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse as if she had screamed too much or cried too much or both. "Please help me, he's coming. My father is coming, and if he finds me, he will." She swallowed, her eyes filling with tears she fought to hold back. "He will kill me this time. I know he will. And I can't die yet, not before." She clutched the battered backpack she was hugging to her chest as if it were the most valuable treasure in the world. "Not before I finish what I started." Marco continued studying her silently, his face revealing none of the turmoil her words had sparked, because he was a man who had built an empire through absolute control over reactions, through never showing surprise or emotion that enemies could exploit. But internally, he was processing multiple layers of this situation, calculating the risks of getting involved versus the costs of ignoring a child who was obviously in genuine danger. He was assessing whether it was an elaborate trap, family drama, or something more complex that he couldn't yet determine without more information. His father, Marco, finally said, his deep, calm voice belittling the urgency of the situation. "Why does he want to kill you? What have you done that would be serious enough for a father to want to eliminate his own daughter?" The girl hesitated, clearly debating how much to reveal, how much truth was safe to share with a stranger who could help or could hand her back to the person she was running from. But desperation won over caution and words began to spill. "My father is a policeman," she said, and Marco saw several nearby customers react subtly because everyone in that restaurant knew who Marco Vitali was, knew he controlled significant criminal operations, knew that the word policeman in his presence usually preceded trouble. "Detective in the narcotics division," she continued, "and everyone thinks he's a hero, that he arrests drug dealers and protects the city and deserves medals and respect." But he trembled. "He's not a hero. He's a monster. He hits my mother when he's drunk. He hits me when he thinks I've been disrespectful. He locks us up without food when he's in a bad mood. And I found out that he lowered his voice even further. I found out that he's receiving money from drug traffickers he's supposedly investigating, that he's protecting operations in exchange for a cut of the profits, that he's completely corrupt and is using his badge to enrich himself while destroying his family at home. Marco leaned back slightly, processing the information, because if it was true, if the girl had evidence of a specific corrupt police officer, that was valuable information, leverage that could be used in multiple ways. But it was also dangerous because police officers protected their own even when they were corrupt, and getting involved would mean making enemies in a department that was already constantly watching him, looking for reasons to arrest him. "Do you have proof?" he asked. Not because he doubted him, but because proof was the difference between an allegation and a weapon. "Do you have evidence of what you're saying? Or is it just a child's word against a respected father?" The girl gripped her backpack tighter, her fingers white from how tightly she was holding it, and nodded vigorously. "I have everything," she said. "Photos of him meeting with known drug dealers, recordings of conversations where he discusses payments, bank statements from a secret account my mother doesn't know exists, showing regular deposits that don't match his salary, documents from cases he intentionally sabotaged to let criminals get away with it. I spent 6 months collecting it all, using an old phone I found in the trash and fixed up, following him when I thought he was at school, noting every suspicious transaction, every lie, every crime he committed while using his badge as a shield." Marco was impressed, despite himself, because this wasn't the work of an ordinary child. It was an investigation conducted with determination and intelligence that suggested the girl was exceptional, a survivor who had chosen to fight instead of just suffering, a real threat to the corrupt man if the evidence was as complete as he claimed. "And he found out," Marco said, not asking, but obviously concluding based on her condition. "He found out you were investigating him." The girl nodded, a tear finally escaping and running down her dirty cheek. "Last night," she confirmed. "He found my backpack hidden where he thought it was safe, saw everything, and then—" she closed her eyes as if the memory were physically painful. "He was angrier than I'd ever seen him. He beat me worse than ever, said I destroyed his family, destroyed his life, destroyed everything, and when my mother tried to intervene, he beat her too, until she stopped moving, and I don't know." She sobbed. "I don't know if she's alive. He locked me in the basement, saying he needed to think about what to do with me. And I overheard him on the phone talking to someone about making me disappear, about accidents happening to troubled children. So when he left this morning, I broke the basement window and ran. I ran all day, hiding when I saw police cars, because I don't know who to trust in the department. I don't know how many others are corrupt like him, and then I saw this place." She looked around the restaurant at the obvious elegance and power of the environment. "And I thought," she said, "I thought that if anyone here could stand face to face with a corrupt cop and not be intimidated, it would be—" she looked at Marco again, "it would be you. Because I read about you when I was investigating drug dealers my father protected. Your name came up, and I know who you are, Mr. Vitale. I know you're a criminal, that you control illegal parts of the city, that you're exactly the kind of person I should be afraid of. But I also know you have a reputation for—" she searched for words, "having a code, of not hurting innocents, of protecting family and loyalty. So I gambled that if I asked for help, maybe you'd be a better option than the cop who's supposed to protect me, but wants to kill me." Marco needed to make a decision, and fast, because if her father was really coming, if he had mobilized police resources to find his runaway daughter, time was running out, and every second of hesitation was a second closer to the situation exploding into public violence, which he definitely didn't want in his restaurant, in front of customers who paid fortunes for meals and discretion. He nodded to Luigi, his second-in-command, who was dining at a nearby table, always vigilant even when appearing casual. And Luigi came immediately, leaning over to listen to quick instructions given in Italian that the girl didn't understand, but which obviously set the plan in motion. "I'll help you," Marco told the girl, and saw relief flood her face so intensely it was almost painful to witness, but he raised his hand before she could thank him. "But you need to understand something. If I do this, if I protect you from your father and use the evidence you collected, you'll be under my protection permanently. Not temporarily until the danger passes, but permanently. Because a corrupt police officer father with connections won't simply give up. He'll pursue you. He'll use the resources he has to find you, and the only way to guarantee your safety is for you to disappear completely from your old life. That means a new identity, A new city eventually. A life without returning to your mother or friends or anything familiar. Can you accept that? Can you live knowing that help comes at the price of leaving everything behind? The girl didn't hesitate. She didn't need to think or debate. She just nodded with a determination that was too mature for her age. I have nothing to leave behind, she said. Mother is dead or close to it because of me. I have no friends because Dad wouldn't let me socialize. I have no life worth saving except, she touched her backpack again, except finishing what I started. Making sure he pays for what he did, that other corrupt police officers are exposed, that evidence that almost cost me my life serves some purpose. If you can make that happen, if you can ensure justice is done even if I have to disappear, then I'll accept any price. Marco nodded, decision made, and was about to give further instructions when the restaurant door burst open again. This time not a desperate child, but a grown man, 6 feet of muscle and rage, military-cut blonde hair, face red with fury or alcohol, or probably both. And his eyes swept across the room until they found the girl huddled beside Marco's table, and the expression that crossed his face was one of vicious triumph, mixed with a promise of violence that would make the previous session of abuse seem like gentleness. "Sarah," he roared, didn't say it, but roared like an animal, his voice echoing in the silent restaurant where everyone had frozen again watching the drama unfold. "Sarah, get out from under that table now. We're going home. And you're going to learn what happens to girls who spread lies about parents who only wanted to protect their family." The girl, Sarah, apparently pressed herself against Marco's leg, absolute terror in her eyes. And Marco felt anger rising, a cold, calculated anger that was more dangerous than an emotional outburst, because when Marco Vitale got cold, people died in ways that sent messages. And the man in front of him, Sarah's father, a corrupt policeman who beat children, was about to learn that there are hierarchies of power and that a police badge was irrelevant when you were in the territory of someone who didn't answer to the law but made their own rules. Marco stood up slowly, a casual movement, but everyone in the restaurant recognized the threat it was. And he stood between Sarah and her father, a physical barrier that declared protection without needing to verbalize it. "Detective," Marco said. Because he recognized the man from his own files on local police officers, he knew it was Thomas Reed, 16 years of service, a history of excessive use of force that the department consistently ignored. And now, apparently, a much dirtier history of corruption and domestic abuse. "You're in my establishment, scaring my customers. I need to ask you to leave before the situation escalates in unpleasant ways for everyone involved." Thomas looked at Marco as if he were an annoying insect. Not a real threat, because he was used to a badge giving automatic authority. Used to people backing down when he pushed, he didn't yet understand that normal rules didn't apply here. "Get out of the way, Thomas," said, stepping forward aggressively. "That's my daughter. It's a family matter. None of your business. I'm taking her home, and you're going to pretend none of this happened. Understood? Or do I need to call for backup and arrest you for obstruction and interference in police matters?" Marco didn't move an inch, didn't back down, showed no intimidation, just smiled a small, cold smile that made several customers who knew him well discreetly leave the restaurant because they knew what was coming. They knew that when Marco smiled like that, someone ended up in the hospital or morgue. "You can try to arrest me," Marco said conversationally. "You can call for all the backup you want." But Detective Reed, he used the name deliberately, establishing that he knew exactly who Thomas was, needs to understand that your daughter asked me for protection, told me interesting stories about your activities that the department would find fascinating, and handed over evidence that supports allegations. So, no, you're not taking her. You're not touching her. You're not even breathing the same air as her until I decide what to do with the situation. Thomas turned purple with rage, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun in its holster. And half of Marco's men, who were spread throughout the restaurant disguised as regular customers, were already moving in response, ready to neutralize the threat before it materialized. But Marco raised his hand again, stopping the action before it began because shooting in a crowded restaurant would attract attention none of them wanted, creating complications that would take weeks to resolve. "Don't be stupid," Marco told Thomas. "You're outnumbered. You're in my territory. And you're being recorded by security cameras that will capture every second of you threatening a minor child in public. So you can leave voluntarily, you can come back when you're sober and rational and prepared to negotiate civilly. Or you can try something idiotic and discover that your badge doesn't protect you from consequences when you cross the wrong people." Thomas was clearly weighing options. Pride and alcohol telling him to escalate, to assert dominance, not to let criminals intimidate him. But self-preservation eventually won out, and he stepped back, hand dropping his weapon. but the look he gave Sarah was one of pure hatred. "This isn't over," he said. "She's my daughter legally. I have rights, and you'll find that protecting a fugitive minor brings problems your criminal empire can't solve." "We'll see," Marco said indifferently. "Now get out before I lose my temper and demonstrate exactly what kind of problems I can create for corrupt cops who irritate me." Thomas finally left, the door slamming shut behind him, and the tension in the restaurant lessened slightly, but didn't disappear completely, because everyone knew this was the beginning, not the end. That the publicly humiliated police officer would return with reinforcements and more elaborate plans, that the situation was about to become significantly more complicated for everyone involved. Marco turned to Sarah, who was still huddled together, trembling not only from the cold and wet clothes, but from the delayed adrenaline rush, the fears she had been holding back while her father was present, and which now overflowed in silent tears she tried to control but couldn't quite manage. "He's gone," Marco said gently, lowering himself to her eye level. "You're safe now. No one will hurt you while you're under my protection. I promise." Sarah looked at him through tears, and something in his sincerity, in the absolute confidence of his words, made her believe in ways she hadn't believed adult promises in years. Not since her father had ceased to be the hero she adored and revealed himself to be the monster who terrified her. Luigi returned at that moment, nodded to Marco indicating that preparations were made, and Marco helped Sarah to her feet, noticing how light she was, how fragile her body seemed under soaked clothes, how much damage years of abuse had caused to her physical and probably emotional development as well. "Let's go somewhere safer," Marco said, gently guiding her toward the back exit where the armored car was waiting. "A place where you can dry off, eat something decent, and show me exactly what's in that backpack that's worth risking your life for." Sarah followed obediently, and as they sped through dark streets toward one of Marco's secure apartments, she finally relaxed a little, finally allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had found real help instead of just inevitably being delayed. The safe apartment was a functional, non-luxurious space in a location known to fewer than 10 people, used for situations exactly like this when temporary protection was needed before permanent solutions were implemented. Marco placed Sarah on a sofa with a dry blanket and turned on the heater because she was still shivering. Then he brought her hot soup that he kept stocked for emergencies, and watched her eat hungrily, confirming suspicions of neglect, of meals being used as punishment or reward depending on the mood of an abusive father. When she finished, when the color finally returned to her face and the trembling stopped, Marco said, "Now show me. Show me what's in the backpack that's worth all this fuss." Sarah hesitated for only a moment, then opened the backpack and began to take out the contents. And what she placed on the table was more thorough, more damning, more professionally compiled than Marco had expected from a 12-year-old's investigation, and he picked up each item, examining it carefully as Sarah explained. "Photos first," she said, scattering dozens of printed images showing Thomas Reed in obviously secret meetings with known drug dealers, with bosses of rival organizations, with intermediaries Marco recognized from his own network. And a date stamp on each photo proved they were recent, not old, that corruption was current, not past already corrected. "I took these using an old phone with a surprisingly good camera," Sarah explained. "I followed him when he said he was going to work, but I actually went to these meetings, stayed hidden, and photographed everything. Later, recordings. A small, cheap, but functional digital recorder, and Sarah played some excerpts. Thomas's unmistakably voice discussing payments, discussing protection he would provide in exchange for percentages, discussing specific cases he would sabotage. And each recording was evidence that alone could destroy his career, but collectively was a nuclear arsenal of legal ammunition. She hid the recorder in his coat, Sarah said, or in the car, anywhere he wouldn't check. I learned to be invisible, to move unnoticed. When you grow up in a home where drawing attention means pain, you learn. Financial documents were third-rate bank statements that Sarah had obtained by stealing mail before. Thomas saw them, photographing the contents, returning them as if they had never been opened, and the numbers didn't lie, showing regular deposits that tripled his official salary. Money movements that perfectly matched drug seizure schedules that mysteriously resulted in lost or corrupted evidence, in cases being dismissed due to technicalities that skilled lawyers exploited. And finally, the category Marco hadn't expected, but which was the most devastating of all, Sarah pulled out a thin notebook, pages filled with careful handwriting documenting every instance of domestic violence. Every injury she and her mother suffered, with dates and detailed descriptions. Some entries including photos of bruises and cuts, a diary of abuse that would be inadmissible evidence in court perhaps, but would be devastating in the court of public opinion, especially for a police officer whose public image was that of a protector and hero. "I documented everything," Sarah said, her voice small but proud every time he heard us, "because I knew that someday I would need proof. Someday I would need to convince someone that I wasn't making it up, that the monster behind the badge was real." Marco was genuinely impressed because this wasn't amateur work. It was a competently conducted investigation that rivaled the professionals he employed. It was evidence any prosecutor would love to have. It was the complete destruction of Thomas Reed, just waiting to be properly publicized. "That is," Marco began, choosing his words carefully. "This is extraordinary, Sarah. You've done work that trained adults would struggle to complete. But you need to understand what that means. Evidence like this can't just be handed over to the department because we don't know how many others like your father are there. How many would protect him out of misguided loyalty or fear of exposure? It needs to be publicized through the media, through channels that enforce accountability. And that means your father will know you're responsible. He'll know you destroyed him. Can you live with that?" Sarah didn't hesitate, her eyes meeting his with a determination that was pure steel. "He destroyed my mother," she said. "He destroyed any chance of a normal childhood. He destroyed the family we should have had. So yes, I can live knowing I got my revenge. I can live very well knowing that monster is locked up where he belongs." Marco nodded, a decision forming because he saw something rare in Sarah. A survivor who had refused to be just a victim, who had transformed trauma into action, who deserved justice, not just protection. And providing both had become a personal mission in ways that surprised even him, because Marco Vitali wasn't known for sentimentality, wasn't known for moral crusades, but something about a brave girl asking for help had touched a part of him that he thought had been dead for a long time. The next 24 hours were a careful orchestration of events, Marco using media contacts to arrange a coordinated leak of evidence, using government contacts to ensure that state investigators, rather than the local department, would receive the case, using contacts in the legal system to ensure that Sarah would be protected as a witness rather than treated as a fugitive. And every move was calculated to maximize impact while minimizing danger to her. Because Thomas would not be inactive, he would be mobilizing his own forces trying to discredit his daughter before evidence became public, trying to find her to silence her permanently. Sarah was kept in a secure apartment under constant guard, and during the waiting period, Marco spent hours talking to her, learning about the exceptional girl whose birth accident had placed her in the wrong family. A girl who, under different circumstances, could have been anything: an engineer, a lawyer, or a detective, ironically, but who instead had been forced to use her intelligence for pure survival. She spoke about her mother, about the woman who had been vibrant and loving before years of abuse broke her spirit, about Sarah's guilt for not having acted sooner when perhaps she could have saved her mother before it was too late. And Marco, surprisingly, shared his own story, about growing up in a family involved in crime, about choices he made and didn't make, about how power was built in a world where normal rules didn't apply. And Sarah listened, fascinated not with romanticization, but with an understanding. That reality was more complicated than the black and white that school taught. That sometimes people doing wrong things were just trying to survive in broken systems. And sometimes people doing right things were worse monsters because they used positions of authority to destroy instead of protect. When the story finally broke, when the mainstream newspaper published a front-page expose with evidence of Sarah, and local television carried the story with recordings playing and photos showing it, when the internet exploded with outrage because a corrupt police officer beating a family while protecting drug dealers was exactly the kind of scandal that captured the public imagination, Thomas Reed tried to flee, tried to disappear before the arrest warrant was executed. But Marco had already anticipated this, already had men watching every possible exit. And when Thomas tried to leave town, he was intercepted not by police, but by citizens who recognized his face from news reports, who held him until authorities arrived, who ensured he would face the justice he had avoided for years. The arrest was filmed, broadcast live, with Thomas shouting that it was a setup, that his daughter had lied, that the evidence was fabricated by enemies wanting to destroy him, but nobody believed him because the evidence was simply too complete, too consistent, too obviously real. And when investigators dug into his life, they found even more. They found connections that Sarah hadn't discovered. They found a network of corruption that went deeper than anyone suspected. And the resulting takedown cleared the department of half a dozen other equally corrupt officers who thought they were protected by a code of silence that ultimately proved worthless when the evidence was so devastating. And Sarah's mother, whom Thomas had left in a coma after the final beating, eventually woke up, eventually recovered enough to testify as well, to confirm years of abuse, to embrace the daughter who had saved them both through courage and determination that was superhuman, considering her age and circumstances. And their reunion was tearful and cathartic, and the beginning of a healing that would take years, but was finally possible because the monster was behind bars where he belonged. Marco arranged new identities as promised, relocating to a different state where mother and daughter could start over without Thomas's shadow hanging over them, where Sarah could finally be a child instead of an investigator, where education would be about learning, not surviving. And he provided financially as well, not charity, but an investment in the future of a girl who had deeply impressed him, who had shown qualities he valued, who deserved every opportunity his money could buy. On the day they left, Sarah hugged Marco tightly. A hug he initially didn't know how to reciprocate, because physical affection didn't come naturally to a man who lived through distance and intimidation, but eventually his arms gently enveloped her, and he felt something strange in his chest, something that could be pride, or it could be paternal affection, or it could simply be the recognition of a human connection he rarely experienced. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, "for believing, for protecting me, for making him pay. You saved our lives." Marco shook his head. "You saved your own lives," he corrected. "I just provided the platform. Courage was all yours. Initiative was all yours. Victory is all yours. Never forget that." And then they were gone, disappearing into a new life that Sarah had bought through 6 months of secret investigation and a desperate escape that ended in the most unlikely place. At the table of a mafia boss who discovered he had a code of honor that corrupt cops didn't possess, who discovered that justice sometimes came from darker places, who discovered that protection offered by a criminal was more reliable than protection supposedly offered by a law enforcement representative. Marco returned to his routine, to the empire that demanded constant attention. But he maintained discreet contact, periodic checks ensuring that Sarah and her mother were safe, were thriving, were building lives they always deserved to have had, and he kept a copy of evidence of her. Not the original, because that one went to prosecutors, but a copy as a reminder that sometimes, rarely but sometimes, power built through questionable methods could be used for genuine good, that criminal empires had an obligation to innocents whom a supposedly legal system failed, that a man like him could choose to be a hero in someone's story, even if he was a villain in dozens of other stories. And years later, when Sarah graduated from college with honors, when she decided to study not criminal law but family law, not to defend criminals, but to protect children in situations similar to the one she escaped, she sent Marco her graduation invitation, and he discreetly attended, sat at the back of the auditorium wearing sunglasses and civilian clothes, watched her give a speech about survival and justice and the importance of having the courage to ask for help in unexpected places, about how salvation sometimes comes from unlikely sources. And when her eyes swept across the audience and met his for a brief moment, the smile they exchanged contained mutual gratitude, contained recognition of a shared journey, contained a truth that they would both always carry, that a girl, fleeing her father with a backpack full of evidence, had changed 2 lives that rainy night, had given Sarah a future, and had given Marco the reminder that humanity could coexist with criminality, that choices mattered even in a world where morality was often gray, that protecting the innocent was a better use of power than any expansion of territory or accumulation of wealth. And the contents of the backpack, evidence meticulously collected by a 12-year-old determined to expose a monster, wearing a badge, became legend in both criminal and police circles. A whispered story about Sarah Reed, who destroyed a corrupt father and found unlikely protection with Marco Vitali. A story that served as a warning that abuse has witnesses even when the abuser thinks power protects, that children have agency even when adults try to break them, that justice finds its way even when the system fails. Because sometimes, just sometimes, a desperate girl runs to the right person at the right time. And a dangerous man chooses to be a hero for once, and these moments change worlds in small but absolutely significant ways that echo through the years, proving that goodness is not the exclusive territory of saints, that evil is not the exclusive territory of criminals, that we all contain the capacity for both, depending on the choices we make when confronted with the suffering of others, and that sometimes the right choice is more obvious than moral complications suggest. A terrified child cries for help, you help, simple as that. The rest is just details on how to execute the rescue, and Marco had executed it perfectly, proving that boss, even within the Mafia, one could have a heart, even if that heart was carefully guarded beneath layers of danger and power, revealed only to the rare few who deserved to see it, and Sarah certainly deserved it.